Okay. So to start out, we're going to do a fun mock, not, I don't know if it's fun, a mock scenario, okay? A mock scenario of Monopoly. Okay, and the only difference is instead of just property, you can also buy eggs. Okay, so you can buy houses and eggs, okay? So in Monopoly, what happens, right? There's a certain amount of players, and then from the bank, they're gonna issue everyone X amount of money, okay? So let's just say it's 500 bucks each. Right, and there's 4 people. How much money is in the system? $2,000. Okay, oh, by the way, I'm giving an analogy, and then obviously it's not a closed, like our economy isn't a closed system like this, but a lot of the main points still hold true, and you'll see why, but just know I'm not making a one-on-one comparison where like this is exactly real life. It's just to help illustrate, okay? So there's $2,000 because there's 4 people, okay? And then when you go around, the property is going to be at a fixed price, right? Like the first ones are the crappy properties, or I don't know even know how much, they're like 20 bucks. And then like the fancy ones on Park Avenue are like $1,000, right? Everyone wants to get those because then when people go to them, you can charge more rent, all that stuff, right? Okay, that's nice and beautiful, a closed system, okay? Now let's just pretend in Monopoly land, we started going through COVID, and then we started using that as an excuse to print more money, okay? So now we are going to print $2,000 more, and then it's not gonna go to any of the big institutions or anything else. It's actually gonna all go to the players, okay? So now, instead of $500 each, we're gonna give everyone else another $500. So now everyone has $1,000, okay? They haven't purchased anything yet, okay? And then how much money is in the system? 4,000 as opposed to 2,000, right? So when that happens, $1 before was 1 out of 2,000, and now 1 is 1 out of 4,000, okay? So when you have less, basically it's still the same nominal value. So nominal is just the number, right? It's still $1, but from a part of the total money perspective, right? It's 1 out of 2,000 instead of 1 out of 4,000. It's actually worth half as much as far as spending power, because now $1 is only 1 out of 4 as opposed to 1 out of 2. Okay, so the purchasing power of that dollar is going to be half as much if everything catches up. Okay, so maybe before this property was $800. My personal strategy in Monopoly was always to buy everything, right? But let's just say before, right? Actually, that's a terrible example. Let me make it like this. Before the property was 300, right? And you had 500 only, that's 60% of your available money. You have to actually think about whether it's worth it to buy or not. You want to save it, because if you just don't have any money, you'd be screwed later. There's another property you would rather buy more. But what if the $300, it was worth 300 still, and it's a very valuable, awesome piece of property, but now you have $1,000, right? You're gonna be more likely to buy it, right? And so is everyone else. So we learn about economy, right? The price is dependent on supply and demand. So if someone wants to buy, someone has to be willing to sell at that price, okay? If people aren't willing to sell at that price, right, then the price will have to go higher until they're willing to sell. So you can have all these buyers, but there's all these buyers, and then no one wants to sell at this price, then the prices can go higher until you can match with a seller, and then vice versa, okay? So if you have no buyer and a bunch of sellers, right, there's one buyer and someone wants to sell here, like hell no, hell no, hell no, hell no. Right here, okay, you know what, I'll buy it, right? Supply and demand, okay? So if we fix this price here, right, all of a sudden, everyone's gonna be willing to buy it. If you actually let the free market decide the price, this price, based on this closed system, should be $600, right? So that's 100% inflation to match with the 100% inflation in the money supply. Okay, same thing with goods or eggs, right? So it's eggs, let's just say it's 500 bucks, maybe for a penny, so $0.01, you would be it's a fair price. But now, you know, as a farmer that sells the eggs, whatever, like that whole supply chain process, that's way too cheap now, okay? Because there's more money in the system, right? A dollar isn't worth as much. I'm gonna need to sell it at 2 cents to actually be able to make a living and to balance everything out, okay? Does that make sense? So when you're printing money, it doesn't come from nowhere, right? It actually starts affecting the price of stuff. So nominally, you could have, say, $10,000 in 1960 versus $10,000 now. It was way more, you had way more purchasing power with that $10,000 in 1960, okay? So one thing that we've been brainwashed into thinking it has to be this way is that inflation is built in, and right, you probably learned this, you know, as a stock trader or whatever, is 3% inflation is just what happens, okay? 3% inflation. Okay, and inflation is basically just a process where you don't lose money nominally, you lose purchasing power year over year over year, right? And the main mechanism that this is happening is because there's more and more money in the supply, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so actually I think they could see this. Can you take a picture just in case? No, just a board. Yeah, board only. That's fine, doesn't matter. Okay, you got it? Sideways. Yeah.
And you're in it?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Now, let's talk about the process of printing money. Okay? So have you heard of the Federal Reserve before? Not from me, but before that?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, that's terrible. Or, you know, central bank. Okay. So, around the world, we've gone to this central bank model of managing our economy, okay? So, the Federal Reserve is just the US's central bank. The central bank is a private institution with shareholders, and their shareholders are a lot of Wall Street banks, actually. And then it gets to the point where who are the shareholders of the Wall Street banks? And a lot of that's not public information. So when you hear a lot of conspiracy theories like, oh, the Rothschilds control the financial system, it's because there's a lot of speculation that the shareholders of the central banks all consolidate into a couple of families, okay? If you want to dig down that conspiracy theory route, you can. I'm not going to talk about that here, but just know that's where it comes from, okay? So the central bank is supposed to be something that is separate from the US government. I have a buddy who works for from college, I wouldn't call him a buddy, a friend from college. He works for the San Francisco Federal Reserve, and he went on a call with him, like I talked to him for probably about like 2 hours, right? He said it over and over to try to make a point that the Fed is independent of the government, we're non-political, blah, 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 we make our own decisions. And I'll show you why I think that's not true, and it's very, very shady, but it's supposed to be separate from the government, okay? The central bank, a private bank, has been tasked with managing the country's economy, okay? And to do that, they say they have a variety of tools, but they all fall under 2 categories. One is interest rate, controlling the interest rate, and the other one is printing money. And it doesn't have to be literally printing money, right? Nowadays, they could just click a button and then boom, the credit appears in the bank's bank account. It's crazy, okay? Two things. Traditionally, how it's supposed to work, when the economy, or the GDP, when we see how the economy is doing, this is GDP, right? So they have this like formula for calculating how much value we're producing per year. And if the economy is doing well, they're gonna slowly hike up the interest rate. So when the economy slows down, the GDP slows down or even like declines, they could lower the interest rate to stimulate the economy. That's the idea, okay? The other one is to print money, okay? So traditionally, you know what bonds are? Okay, so bonds, like the government issues basically a IOU, and then we're going to guarantee this percentage, right? If you talk to most financial advisors, like bonds are, it's the most secure thing because it's backed by the U.S. government, right? Last year, at one point, and it's not called a bond. I think depending on the year, one's like treasury note, one's a right. It's like there's 1 year, 10 years, like 30 year. And I heard a Fed chairman talk about recently about issuing a 50-year and then potentially a 100-year bond. It's crazy. But last year, actually in 2019, late 2019, the 10-year bonds yield. So if you buy a bond that's going to mature in 10 years versus 1 year, that number actually inverted. So if you commit the money longer, typically you should be getting a higher interest rate, right? But because there was so little trust in the economy in late 2019, I think October of 2019, the 1-year bonds yield was actually higher than the 10-year bonds yield. This was before COVID hit the US, and usually when that happens, that's a clear sign that a bad recession is coming. It happened before 1929, it happened, I forgot when's the huge stock market crash, and then the whole shit, it's either late 70s or 80s, I don't know the exact year, but there's like, it always happens, okay? So that actually happened in late 2019. Now, central bank usually buys bonds, right? When they buy the bonds, they get the bonds, so, I don't know if you can see this, that's an A and an L, right? So they're purchasing bonds, and then to purchase the bonds, deposit money credits into the treasury. And then the treasury could either issue that credit out, or they could print money that they got from the central bank. That's how we create more money, okay? If they buy $1.9 trillion worth of bonds, right, it actually goes on liability, okay? Because they created that money and then pushed it out, so now that's actually a liability that's on their balance sheet. So whenever you hear like the national debt or the global debt, like what the hell is a global debt? Who the hell does the world owe money to? It's actually not that we owe money to anyone. If anything, it's we owe money to the people, okay? It's actually the number on the liabilities, okay? So doesn't this seem a little odd to you, right? That a bank can just manage and print money and do whatever they want, decide what they want, and they're independent, and they're a private. Oh, by the way, their stockholders, I think the annual dividend is 6.5%. So their stockholders actually get paid money every year for printing money and doing this stuff. Okay. Now, when you hear the word stimulus, okay, what's happening? This interest rate is, last I saw, it was between 0 and 0.25%, so it's pretty much at zero. They can't lower it anymore, right? Even though they could technically go into negative interest rates. So that's basically where, if something's a negative interest rate, if you deposit $100, it's a negative interest rate of 2%. It's a guarantee that by next year, you're gonna have $98 in your bank account, okay? And that's starting to show up in Europe, and then there's talks that we might go into negative interest rates here. Don't quote me on this off the top of my head. I thought I read that Canada was going into negative interest rates. If they're not, the speculation is they're going to go there soon, okay? So they already can't do this anymore, okay? So the only other thing they can do is just to print money, okay? Now remember the monopoly scenario, right? Do you like $1,200 in your bank account? Of course, yeah, right? Yeah, like, so it's like, hey, you know what? We need a stimulus. We need a stimulus. It's gonna be for the people, okay? What's happening is the central bank, they're not just purchasing bonds now, they're purchasing other stuff, which gets a little shady because one of the things that the central banks have been acquiring is bonds from private companies. And like large private companies, like I know Toyota was one, Apple was one, basically companies that are actually thriving, okay? So now they're actually pumping money into private companies that don't need help to purchase, to stimulate the economy. It just, you know, and then people are economically illiterate to actually even follow it. It's just something like plain sight, hey, we're doing this, and then people are just like, blah, 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 you know, whatever. Where's my $1,200, okay? So if there's $1,200, right, and it's stimulus money, and it goes on the liability sheet, right? If it's a closed system, even though it's not, right? The biggest thing when it's not a closed system is that theoretically, as more and more people are born, there's more people in the world, there's more GDP, you can inflate the money supply to kind of match it, and then you should be able to control the money supply. Okay, that's kind of a big difference between a closed and open system. Whereas when it's a closed system, right, there's just 4 people playing Monopoly, boom, as soon as you print out the money, you put it in, it's right there. And the inflation will be right away. So when you print out $1,200 per person, right, and you account for like the American population, that comes to close to $400 billion. So if you do that, great, but the stimulus package is $1.2 trillion, and one of the questions is, where's the other $800 billion? Okay, never mind the $400 billion that you just printed out. What about the other $800 billion? Okay, where is that going in the money supply? Okay, and there's disagreements on this because essentially we're talking about human beings, right? So there's like a social science to it, and a lot of the economists, right, they're going off of mathematical models. Okay, so when everything's about math, you take out the human element, you're not dealing with a lab experiment. There's actually a human component, which is why you can't isolate a independent variable, right, and then test that, right? So a lot of it is economic theory. That's why you keep hearing it called theory. And also that's probably one of the biggest shortcomings I see of a lot of economic models is that they're doing the math part, but they're not actually taking into account the human element. Okay, so let's just say person A and person B, okay? And we're playing a Monopoly, okay? If you know you had $500, okay? And then you were gonna get another $500, how does that change your habit? You personally, what would you actually do, not do?
If I had an extra $500.
Yeah.
I would probably spend it, save some, and then spend some on something I've been holding up on buying.
So you would spend some and save some that you will hold off on buying. Okay. Now, if you spend it into the economy, right? That's the idea behind a stimulus, is that we give people money, they're going to pump it into the economy and spend it, so then you're gonna create money velocity, and then or the speed at which money changes hands, and then if you have a lot of velocity in the economy, it will actually stimulate growth, and also something they don't talk about is it will stimulate inflation, okay? Because they need inflation, because as the liability of debt gets more and more, right, the less that debt is worth in purchasing power. So let's just say what you could buy before for $1, it takes you $100 to buy now, right, because it's 1/100th, and that's actually about how much our money has inflated away in the last like 110 years, right? Then if the debt is $1 trillion, which is 1,000 billion, divided by 100, right, then it would actually only be about $10 billion. So one of the ways they control that growing debt is to have inflation, right? It sounds bad. It's bad for us. It's good for the government and the central banks because it allows them to just print more money without needing to deal with the consequences, even though you'll soon realize there's no such thing, right? As the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the psychological pressure gets bigger and bigger, okay? So Now, what if you have $500, okay, and then let's say, Amy, you're middle class, so, kind of middle class, not doing too bad, not doing too great, and now we're gonna do a stimulus, so you're gonna get $5,000. Okay, so whatever money you have right now, we're gonna print 10 times as much and give it to you and everyone else. Everyone gets the equivalent of 300 grand right now. What do you think happens?
Want to buy the new house.
Okay, you're gonna go and try to buy something bigger. Okay, what about everyone else?
They're doing the same.
They're probably gonna wanna do the same thing. So what's gonna happen in the house price?
They're going to go up.
Right, so they have to be careful because if they print too much money at once and they just completely rock the psychology of how we relate to prices, the price is going to fluctuate too big. You're going to crash the economy. Does that make sense? Okay. What if we're not going to do $5,000? You're going to get $100 a month from the government. Which, by the way, we already have that, right? Where for depending on lower income, whatever, you could easily cheat the system and qualify for it. But when you just make it more universal, where more the middle class, it's called UBI, Universal Basic Income, and there's a lot of people starting to advocate for UBI, right? And this used to be something that was ridiculous. I never thought it would happen here in the U.S., but starting in 2020 till now, the push for UBI is getting bigger and bigger. Okay, so what if you get $100 a month, starting next month, and you know it's going to come? How does that change your psychology? Okay, so I'm gonna make up your monthly income is about $5,000 a month right now. Okay. Now, starting next month, the government is gonna give you $1,000 extra a month. First of all, if you don't understand this mechanism, you'll be like, would you take it and be happy? Of course, right? Who wouldn't want $1,000 extra dollars? Let's just say you don't make $5,000 a month, you're making $2,000 a month, and you got $1,000. Now you're making 33% more money a month. Of course you'd be happy. Of course, when the politician gets up front and talks about it, you're like, yeah, I support this person, right? So how would this change your spending or your psychology, or how you were going to relate to how you budget, though?
I think you would.
The government is going to guarantee you're going to get $1,000 extra a month.
Increase your monthly expenses.
Mm-hmm. So you're going to budget for that in there. Okay. Okay. As you budget for that in there, right, it becomes more real. And then when you budget for that in there, inflation is going to actually start taking hold more, right? Whereas if it's a one-time thing, you can see how okay, you might just buy this one thing, whatever. A lot of people, when the first stimulus, $1,200 came out, there was a record number of brand new Robinhood accounts with $1,200 as their starting in their portfolio, right? And then people got into stocks. Now, when you go into this bubble called the stock market, right, and the money's floating around that bubble, it's actually not coming out into the actual economy, right? This is just make-believe land. And that's why you could be in a bubble, you could still make more money, right? And it's actually not causing the inflation, okay? Because people are saving in their bank account, it's not floating around the economy. They're going to the stocks, right? They're just not necessarily spending as much. Like you even said, you're gonna save some of it, right? If it becomes a huge amount, you're gonna crash the economy right away because it's gonna just alter how we perceive the nominal value of money. If you start making it a UBI, right, people are gonna start budgeting that in, and then that's also gonna, basically, that velocity or change in how we perceive money is gonna float into the economy more. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so, okay, let's give another scenario for stimulus, okay? Middle class, below middle class, and then the haves, the really, really rich people, okay? When the money starts flowing in, so when there's a stimulus, the typical flow is gonna be the top down, okay? The people that are already in positions of power Like the institutions, you know, they have control, like, you know, when you have a crap load of money, they're gonna actually be able to get a bigger portion of it, okay? Then it kind of trickles down to the middle class, right? And then usually the people below the middle class, they don't even have the means to even take advantage of the system, right? They just kind of get, you know, who knows if they file their taxes. Like that's one of the things with the stimulus. Did you file your taxes? How many of these people file their taxes, right? So do they even get the money? No, right? The middle class gets less, but this gets more, right? So you hear about the wealth gap being bigger and bigger and bigger. That's one of the reasons, because anytime we do this monetary policy, it's flowing this way, right? It's being painted as it's helping middle class and below middle class, but it's actually helping these people more, and they'll just pump the money into other investments, whatever, right? And then they also are the ones that get more of the insider trading information, all that stuff. So they know market trends that are coming, and they could pull out. And then the retail investors, which is usually like middle class, that's mixing around the stock market, they're the ones that really get screwed the most. Okay, like these guys are already converting everything to gold and silver over time, slowly, and these people are going in this because this is being hyped up in a bubble, and then when it pops, these people get screwed. Okay, so as you do more and more stimulus on the balance sheet, as there's more and more inflation, the pressure on the wealth gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, and there's all these, and everything I'm saying is you could statistically back it up. The income inequality and the gap has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger from like 1970 to like back to 1930. You could just see this whole system. Okay, the central bank Federal Reserve was established in the U.S. I think 1913. Before that, the 100 years before that, there was relatively little inflation because we were on a gold standard. Okay, and then and I'm not going to go there because it's a rabbit hole, but just like in my opinion, this whole system, the reason why it was set up was very shady to begin with, and it wasn't there to help the U.S. economy. It was there to secure, like for banks to secure their power, and then so no matter what the intention are of the people, you know, my friend that worked at the Federal Reserve, just this whole mechanism isn't set up for success, right? Like unless people stop being greedy and are actually there to help everyone else, right? When you have this mechanism, you're going to create more of a wealth gap. So every time there's a stimulus, right, your money is potentially going to be devalued more, and there's not necessarily like a specific amount, right? They could print 10 times as much. It's when the people's trust or confidence in the money psychologically breaks. As soon as your trust in the money breaks, so let's just say after a while the $100 doesn't work, right? So they're like, okay, we're going to start printing and giving you $400 a month, okay, on top of what you already make. What are you going to do with your money now? So you were accounting for $5,000 a month before. Now you're budgeting for $9,000 a month. But like, wow, they're just printing more and more money, and you're like, I don't really trust the money. What are you going to do?
Invest in cryptocurrency.
Invest in crypto, or you're going to move out of money,
Yes.
fiat money that just they could print more of, into something that you consider a better investment, right? So like, as soon as that breaks, you're going to see people start flooding out looking for other stuff, and then we're not going to value money anymore. Okay, so hyperinflation is a psychological thing. No one could predict when it's going to happen. It has nothing to do with how much money supply is printed. It's more when, as a whole, we reach that tipping point when psychologically we don't have trust in the money. Okay, and that's something the economists, some really smart ones out of respect, they know this. Other ones, they believe in the MMT, modern monetary theory, that you could just keep printing more of it as long as the government can enforce it, which is, you know, it sounds very like a dictatorship, if you ask me. Okay, any questions to this? Okay, any comments?
It's interesting because I haven't looked into this deeply.
Yeah.
And the stimulus I didn't really understand, but now when I think about it, of course, that it actually goes from the top down because of all the loans and all the benefits to businesses and corporations.
So we're going to spend, right? And then, no, they're just printing more money, and then they're literally screwing with the money system, and then these people aren't going to get screwed. These people are already underprivileged anyways. It's really the middle class that gets screwed over, okay? And here's a couple other ones I forgot, okay.
Can I
Yeah.
Another thing, when you're speaking about the bubble in the stock market, it really makes you, which we understand, reflect on the disjointed nature of the whole system of the stock market. Because the money actually doesn't trickle into the businesses, the corporations.
Yeah, it just floating around the stock market. So and
it's a money-making mechanism in itself.
And it's called an unrealized gain, right? Because you haven't realized it. Okay. So a couple other things people will bring up. So let me erase this.
Do you want to take a picture?
Yeah, let's take a picture. Okay. So an argument people make is so USD, US dollar, peso, Mexican peso, even though there's a bunch of other countries with pesos. I think the Filipino currency is also called a peso. That's crazy, yeah. And then RMB, renminbi, which is the Chinese currency, okay? So someone's like, okay, well, if we're printing a lot more here, right? So we're printing a lot more here, 3 checks or 3 positives, right? But we don't print pesos and we don't print RMB, then relative to the price of peso, again, if it's a closed system, right? The US dollar is gonna be less valuable relative to the peso. That makes sense, right? Exchange rate, because now there's a lot more US dollars and the peso stay the same, right? It's gonna inflate in price or be less valuable relative to the peso and RMB. That makes sense, right? So if they were all printing at the same rate, they're all going up, then it's all gonna balance out. What's the big deal, right?
Canadian dollar.
Huh?
Canadian dollar and the US dollar, right?
What do you mean? I'm not sure. The Canadian, okay. But like, you get like, if, let's just say these 3 are exchange rate, right? Exchange rate wise, so they're all printed this much relative to how much they had before in a closed system, they're gonna inflate at the same rate, it's fine, right? But that doesn't take into account what we drew earlier, right? How does that change relative to the price of a house? Right? Or how does that change relative to you buying some eggs or other goods? Okay, you could create money, but you're not also printing more houses or more eggs, okay? And this, no matter how great this looks, you still got to deal with reality. So one of my favorite quotes by Ayn Rand is, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality, okay? Now, I think where we're heading towards is, this is on the verge of collapsing, okay? If I had to give my best guess, it could be the next 2 weeks to at most 2 years. I think we're at the end of the line, so it's almost like a heroin addict, right? First you just get a little hit, you feel like high, and you need a bigger and bigger and bigger hit, and at a certain point, you need such a big dose to even feel anything that you just die, okay? And that heroin addict is our current economic system, okay? And you can see there's lots of signs of it. Or like another example would be, you're opening a credit card to pay off the first credit card, right? Every subsequent credit card you open up, you're gonna need a bigger balance to cover the interest to paying for the other credit cards than the one before. And then when your credit score gets low enough, or people's confidence in their credit is low enough, then they're not gonna issue you a credit card. And then the trust in money dies, okay? So you could hear a lot of world financial elites and like central banks across the world talk about a thing called a great reset. Like, what are we resetting to? You know, it's very, very interesting, right? But you could hear this word, you could look it up. They're all using the term great reset. And I think they all know this. They all know this is happening. So whenever Trump got on TV and talked about stimulus and the economy, or now Biden or Obama, right? You either don't understand this mechanism, which I highly doubt, or you're lying. I can't see a third option. So you're misleading the people, or you don't understand this. I'm some dude in a gym who don't have a background in this, who's explained this to you. There is no way they don't know this, right? And the same thing with the Treasury secretaries and everything. I think they're just straight up lying. okay? And why are they lying? Why are they using COVID as an excuse for printing more money? I don't know. But Japan tried quantitative easing, which is stimulus, right? And from 1995 to 2007, their nominal GDP, not even adjusted for inflation, just the number actually went down from like 5 point something trillion to like 4 point something trillion over a 12-year period. So it proved stimulus didn't work. We did QE1, the first round of stimulus in 2008, QE2 in 2010, QE3 in 2013, and then QE4 we actually started September of 2019. And then COVID really hit the US in March of 2020, right? When people actually started taking it seriously. And that's when we announced we were printing money. But this latest round of money printing, or QE, we actually started before COVID ever came to the States, okay? But it's very, very convenient to say COVID is the reason why we need to do QE. We were already starting it before. So this is gonna tie into what's happening right now with Robinhood and Gamestop stock and everything. And I'm gonna move over to crypto, okay? So if you haven't been paying attention, this started happening, I want to say like 4 days ago. So have you ever heard of Reddit? Okay, so Reddit is like basically it's a community forum, right? There was a Reddit group called Wall Street Bets. Okay, that basically got a bunch of hype and got a bunch of people to buy GameStop stock. Okay. And the ticker, I think, is GME. So it went from a low of, I want to say it was like down to $3 or $7, like last year, whatever the low point was. And then the highest it actually hit was, I think like $480 as of like today. Okay, so it went from like $3 or let's just say $7. I think before this run up, it was right around $20, right? They got the hype and everyone jumped in, okay? Now the reasoning behind why they wanted to do it, because there was a big hedge fund, multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, I think it was called Melvin, that was shorting GameStop, okay? So when you short it, there's a couple of different ways to do it. I didn't dig too deep into it, but like one way you could short it is, it's called like a naked short, which technically was supposed to be illegal after 2008, but when you're doing a naked short, naked or means uncovered. Let me write that actually. Okay, when it's uncovered, it's basically whatever asset it is that you're trading, you actually there's not enough of it. It's almost like imaginary. You can see how shady it is, okay? So if you're naked shorting, and even though it's illegal according to the Security and Exchange Commission, SEC, there's all these loopholes where you could basically naked short without naked shorting, okay? So when you're doing a naked short, essentially you can borrow the stock, right? Or you could just how do I want to say this? When it's naked, you're essentially borrowing more stock than that actually exists. Okay, so let's just say, for example, there's 100 GameStop stocks. That's not true, right? 100 GME total. You can fictionally, make believe, borrow 1,000 shares, right? So now you borrowed it, so I have this amount, and then actually sell that at a price to someone else. So let's just say you're selling it to person A, okay? And then if you're shorting, you're counting on the fact that when the contract expires, it's going to be worth less than it is now. So let's say right now it was at $20, right? And then If you're shorting, you're like, okay, it's going to go down to $10. Okay, you're shorting. So basically, if you lose $10 over 1,000 shares, right? Let me do the math off the top of my head. That's $10,000, right? So you actually made $10 because you're going to buy it back later. So you sold it to them at $20 a share, 1,000, and then you plan on buying it back later. Okay. Now, when it's a naked short, there's only 100 stocks, right? So basically, you could create this huge inflated amount, and then start making a bunch of make-believe money this way. Okay. You can see how shady it is. This is a common thing amongst people with a lot of money and hedge funds. Okay. Now, what happened with Wall Street Bets? They're like, let's screw these people. I actually really wish they did it with a more fundamentally sound company, because they did it with like AMC too, and so the movie theater and GameStop. And fundamentally, these companies are dying. Okay, so why support GameStop? Because it's financially not doing well, right? Might as well support something that's artificially being suppressed, like silver. But they decided to go with GameStop. Okay, now so instead of going to $10, this thing went to $480. Okay, so now instead of making $10,000 here, right? If you sold it at 1,000, at 20, and then you have a contract to buy it back in a month at 480 bucks, basically your loss can be unlimited, right? So this 1,000 times 480 is 480,000. Okay, and obviously they're playing with much higher money. But like, if they were planning on doing it, the equity they thought they had, they were risking was about 20 grand. When it's naked, you're opening yourself to unlimited loss. Okay, there's no way they could cover this. Okay, I don't know what they call it when it's a hedge fund, but when you can't cover your contracts and future bids like this, and just personal trading, it's called getting liquidated. Okay, it's called getting liquidated. Okay, so basically, let's just say this right now. Actually, I don't want to get there because I don't want to make it more complex and start explaining like complex stuff. But you could just see how they weren't planning on this happening. They were planning on this happening. Okay, now if Melvin can't cover this, right? They can't actually pay this out. They are actually borrowing their money from another bank. Okay, so they borrow money from another bank, and they have investments from another bank, and then if they end up getting closed out or they just fail, then it's on the bank. Then that burden actually goes on the bank. Okay. Now, if this bank can't cover it, then it actually goes higher up to a much bigger bank. Right now, you're probably getting like Goldman Sachs, whatever, and then eventually it'll go back to the Federal Reserve, where they just can't cover it. Okay. So this is so funny, and this started from a Reddit group doing this. Okay, what they're doing is technically illegal, right? It's open trading, but it just went up. Melvin actually ended up closing out their position yesterday, and the other hedge funds had to come in and bail them out. And then as of like 11, I think this morning, or like 10 or 11, Robinhood, Fidelity, all the major exchanges closed trading of GameStop stock to retail investors. So you can sell, but you can't buy anymore. Okay, they closed it. And at the same time, institutional investors, hedge funds, stuff like that, we're still allowed to trade GameStop. This is today. And it's the funniest thing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? So like, if you're into politics, it's a very, very polarizing figure. It's a senator from New York, like very liberal. And then Ted said like, this is not right, blah, blah, blah. And you had Ted Cruz, which is he Kentucky? Actually, I don't remember. But like Ted Cruz was like a Republican senator. Go, I agree. Like everyone's just like an outrage, because this is just blatant manipulation and rigging. Okay, you closed it to retail investors, so they can't do this, but then you're still allowing institutions to trade. So then once it closed down, right, GameStop stock dropped from like 480. Last I checked before I started this, it was down to 180. And it hit a high of 480 today. And they're trying to drive the price down, because this contract that they had, the first one coming up, the futures, I don't know if they were doing futures or options, I didn't look into it, that one actually expires Friday. So whatever the maturity date for Friday, so midnight Thursday, right, Friday, whatever that is, right, they're gonna be on the hook for that. So they literally colluded to shut this down so they could drive the price down so the hedge fund doesn't get screwed, okay? And like, obviously I'm explaining this, right? Like hopefully like people that watch it understand this more. This is why it's a big deal. And this is why you should be outraged, because it's so shady and people just put up with it, okay? So this kind of ties into, can I take a picture? This kind of ties into what I was talking about earlier, QE4, quantitative easing 4. And I'm going to end with here, I'm going to go into crypto, okay? Okay, so it was QE1 in 2008. It was like $800 billion. Everyone was like, oh my God, right? $1 trillion is $1,000 billion. Right now, Biden's like $1.9 trillion, and we're going to do more later. No one even blinks. And like, oh wait, we heard like 800 billion and we freaked out. Okay, just the heroin, bigger credit card, you can see that happening, okay? So QE4, which is where we're in, started in September 2019, okay? The liquidity in the shadow banking system dried up. It sounds shady, supposed to, but it's shadow banking is basically financial institutions that aren't regulated like actual banks, like commercial banks. So some shadow banking institutions are hedge funds. More like investment banks, so like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. What's another shady one? You get the idea, right? And things like that. So basically, they can do a lot of stuff with creating money out of thin air that aren't regulated by the U.S. government. I don't think like banks are actually off the hook, and I'll explain why. But this gets really, really shady, and they're completely unregulated. Okay, and where the Federal Reserve had to actually start QE was in the repo market. And repo is short for repurchasing. And agreement. And repurchasing is basically just like, hey, I'm gonna lend you this money for 3 days and you have to give it back, like that, kind of like short term, and it's a crap load of money that they're able to move around in a short amount of time, okay? It's like a lot of stuff that we don't really get to focus on, but this market is really, really huge, and it's just for the really, really rich institutional banks and stuff. They just kind of funnel money around to support each other, okay? This somehow crashed in late September, early October of 2019, and the Fed had to actually step in to bail this out, and nobody really talked about it. You could look up like Forbes, you could look up articles where they talk about it, but it was not really covered in the media, and even if they did talk about it, what would the normal American care, right? So they've been printing money nonstop ever since. That straight into COVID, and then straight through until 2021, okay? So all this should make you very, very wary of our current economic system and what leads us to crypto.